Cruz, her Senate Foreign Relations. Senator, it's good to have you back on, sir. What's your reaction to this? Why is this coming out now?
Well, listen, this is a bombshell report. You now have two major agencies in the Biden administration who have admitted what I think has been blazingly obvious for over 2 years, which is that the COVID virus escaped from a Chinese government lab, and the millions of deaths are a result of that virus escaping from a Chinese government lab. You now have the Biden Energy Department that has concluded that it is more likely than not that the virus escaped from a Chinese government lab. Not only that, the Biden FBI has likewise concluded that is the most likely source. This is incredibly relevant on number of fronts. Number one, the media, the corporate media, for 2 years has been lying about this. They have been labeling as misinformation and conspiracy theory the obvious inference, which is that this escaped from a Chinese lab, I think likely the Wuhan Institute of Virology. That every one of the media outlets that echoed those talking points from the Chinese Communist Party, every Democrat politician that echoed those talking points should be held accountable. But secondly, we need real transparency, and the government of China needs to be held accountable for the millions of lives that have been lost because of this virus, for the trillions of dollars of damage in terms of jobs destroyed, businesses destroyed, the world economy brought to its knees because of China's culpability.
Senator, shouldn't the Energy Department, FBI, disclose what they know? What is this new intelligence? Because, you know, we've been waiting 3 years already. 3 years is too long to wait. Shouldn't they disclose it?
Absolutely, yes. This should be made public. The public has a right to know, not just the American public, the entire world, because China's culpability for COVID is of relevance to every country on the face of the planet. And all of this needs to be made public. We should be having hearings in Congress. Now, sadly, Senate Democrats don't want to have hearings. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee, on which I serve, should have hearings on this. The Senate Judiciary Committee, on which I serve, should have hearings on this, on the liability that China faces and should face for its culpability here. And the thing that is frustrating, Elizabeth, these facts were evident over 2 years ago. Over 2 years ago, I did a deep dive on the facts demonstrating that this was the source of COVID. I do a podcast every week called Verdict with Ted Cruz. Back in 2020, I laid out these facts in the spring of 2020. Today's podcast, on the Verdict podcast, I do a deep dive of all of the evidence that was present 3 years ago and is present now. And repeatedly, the media outlets that denied it and covered up for the Chinese Communist government.
You know, how can the media and even Dr. Fauci attack this as conspiracy theory from the get-go, at the start of the pandemic? How could they be so definitive about it when nobody knew? I mean, why not investigate the evidence? I mean, Dr. Fauci first called this, lab leak theory, quote, a shiny object that will go away. But then he testifies in a lawsuit brought by Missouri and Louisiana that he dismissed the lab leak to placate China out of fear it would, quote, increase tensions with China.
Well, Dr. Fauci's behavior on this has been abominable. I think he has done more damage than any bureaucrat in the history of the United States. He has championed policies that have hurt millions of Americans, hurt millions of school kids in particular. And he has also done more to damage the credibility of the United States government when it comes to medical and scientific advice, because Dr. Fauci allowed his advice to be politicized. We know Dr. Fauci, in writing, asked Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook to suppress references to the origin of COVID being from a Chinese government lab. And he did so, I think, in part because there's a very real possibility that Fauci himself bears culpability. I believe Dr. Fauci has lied to Congress, which is a felony, when he has stated that the federal government did not fund gain-of-function research in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Since then, the National Institutes for Health, in writing, has contradicted that. And if the Biden Justice Department were enforcing the law, they ought to be investigating Dr. Fauci for lying to Congress, which is a federal crime. To date, the Biden DOJ has been too political to hold Dr. Fauci accountable.
Well, to your point, Senator, let's show then White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki go along with that narrative, attacking the leak theory, and then watch NSA Sullivan basically confirm it over the weekend. Watch.
I would caution you against disproving a negative there, which is never the responsible approach in our view.
President Biden has directed repeatedly every element of our intelligence community to put effort and resources behind getting to the bottom of this question. And one of the things in that Wall Street Journal report, which I can't confirm or deny, but I will say the reference to the Department of Energy, President Biden specifically requested that the national labs, which are part of the Department of Energy, be brought into this assessment because he wants to put every tool at use to be able to figure out what happened here. Right now, there is not a definitive answer that has emerged from the intelligence community on this question.
Is it irresponsible and is it unproductive for the Biden White House, and today the press secretary says it's unproductive, to investigate what Dr. Fauci was saying and what government officials were saying? Isn't it the responsible thing to do that? Because were the government's efforts to get China to disclose the origin of the pandemic, was that slowed down by government and White House censorship and media censorship? I mean, we can't ever let this happen again, Senator.
Look, absolutely. And, you know, it's really unfortunate that the Biden White House says it's unproductive to investigate the federal government lying to the American people about something that literally cost millions of people's lives, something that was devastating to our nation. I'll tell you just 3 facts that were evident 2 years ago. Number one, the Wuhan Institute for Virology is located just a few hundred yards away from the wet market where the first public outbreak occurred in Wuhan. The Wuhan Institute for Virology was studying coronaviruses derived from bats that don't occur naturally in China. They're 900 miles away from Wuhan, but that's where the outbreak occurred. Number two, in November of 2019, before the pandemic globally, 3 different researchers from the Wuhan Institute of Virology were hospitalized with severe symptoms that suggest that they may well have had COVID, and that might have even been how the virus escaped initially. And here's fact number 3. When this pandemic began spreading, the Chinese Communist government, which had already stockpiled protective equipment, destroyed the samples in that lab so that there would be no evidence of their culpability. They destroyed the samples and they disappeared whistleblowers. That is, in the legal context, that is indicative of a guilty conscience, and in a court of law you could draw an inference that if they're destroying evidence, it's because the evidence would demonstrate that the Chinese Communist government has direct responsibility for the deaths and the trillions of dollars of damage caused by this pandemic.
Senator, what you said is really powerful. What does the Senate Republicans, what do you think House Republicans are going to do next?
Well, I am grateful that we have a Republican majority in the House. I have every confidence that this House majority will have real investigations and try to have real scrutiny. And listen, I would call to my Democrat colleagues in the Senate. Why on earth is today's Democrat Party in the Senate trying to cover up for China's bad conduct? Why are they wanting the American people not to have visibility in what happened here? This is the conclusion of the Biden Department of Energy and the Biden FBI. That is serious. And it seems to me my Democrat colleagues in the Senate ought to be equally concerned about China's responsibility. I know the American people, I know 30 million Texans are concerned about it, and I think the American people across the country are as well.
Senator Cruz, a pleasure having you on, sir. It's good to see you again.
You.
Thanks for joining us. Let's welcome